So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll just get right into it. Let me just see if I can hide the webcam because it's in the way. All right. So Composer 2.0. It was released almost 2 months ago. However, the development began quite a long time ago. We actually had almost 2 years of well, I guess a little bit over 2 years, really, if you count the initial commits on the 2.0 branch. So this was quite a long effort. It involved, as you can see, 28 contributors for the code, but it really involved like tons of people that just tested it and reported issues, suggested new features, new ways of doing things, and so on. So, so big thank you to all of them, really. And also a big thank you to the private packagist customers who really enabled us, like they really allowed us to spend a lot of time on the open source like development, and that really made this possible, because like at this point I just don't have enough time in evenings and weekends. Like we actually need to do this during work time somehow. So what were our goals for 2.0? The main thing really was performance. I think that's the one thing that people complain about over and over. The other aspect that was more like for us, I guess, to some extent. I mean, it's improving the user experience, but it's mostly improving the maintainability of the project, I would say, is to get better reproducibility. Because a lot of the bugs that were left in 1.x were really things that were like really super weird edge cases that, you know, depended on this particular state of the vendor directory, for example. And then if you have that vendor directory plus that state of dependencies and you do that command, then something goes bad. But that's just really, really hard to reproduce, especially when people go like, oh, I had this, but then I wiped my vendor directory and now I can't reproduce it. And you're like, well, okay, but now we can't help you. So this is something we also worked really hard on fixing. Better error reporting for when dependency resolution doesn't go through. That was quite some effort as well, but I think it will pay off in terms of like much more readable output when resolution fails. And then finally, yeah, just like a bunch of new features that had been waiting for a long time and that were made easier by the fact that we could actually refactor internally without fearing that we would break stuff. Then finally, just as a little hint here, keeping the upgrade path as painless as possible was definitely a huge goal, because we want to get everyone to update. So why did we need to do a 2.0 and not just like another 1.x release? To see that, we have to kind of look at what makes it slow, right? So we have mostly it's I/O and like just loading lots of JSON metadata over the network, and then you get the dependency resolution, which does a lot of memory access to build up the entire dependency tree. I'll get back to that in a second. And then finally, we download the package files and so on. And so it's just tons of I/O. And like in some cases, we also had some CPU issues or like CPU bottlenecks, let's say, but I think mostly it was kind of I/O bound slowness. So if we look at the memory, like what is Composer using memory for? and you may have seen these memory issues with some projects at this point on V1 are using like 2 or 3 gigabytes of memory, which is kind of crazy. So what's all this needed for? So we have like every version has an object that represents that version of that package. And so for every possible version, let's say, that may fit a requirement, we need to have an object there with a bunch of JSON metadata. And then on top of that, we have the SAT solver, which is like the dependency solver, which then needs to represent all those inter-package dependencies and conflicts and so on. So the big solution there really is to reduce the amount of packages and like to reduce the amount of versions that we're looking at. And then the other aspect is for the SAT solver to kind of reduce the amount of conflicts and inter-package links that we have. So in Composer 1, we have like we had a model where initially this sounded like a smart way to do this, but we quickly learned that it wasn't. It's that it kind of lazy loaded packages while solving the dependencies. So it was like looking at dependencies, and like the solver itself was kind of looking at the dependencies and finding a new package it needed, and then going like, okay, let's go and look up on packages if this package exists and so on, load the versions, and then load that up, and then find most of this that is needed, and then load these up and so on. And so that made the whole process actually super complex because all the code was kind of glued together there. And ultimately, you actually don't really save any time because you do end up to load all the packages anyway. So in V2, what we did is that we split this up into really separate steps where like first we fetch all the packages that are going to be needed, and then we try to trim that down to a set of versions that will most likely fulfill the requirements. And then finally, we pass that on to the solver to build up all the conflicts and all the rules between the packages. So doing this really required like a massive backwards compatibility break, not from a user point of view, but from a plugin point of view, because the internals had to change a lot. And some plugins do integrate fairly deeply with the internals of Composer. And so that really meant we had to make it a 2.0. And then once we started off with that 2.0, we kind of went crazy and just thought, okay, that's our one chance to clean stuff up. So we just went wild, and that's why it took so long, I guess. But on the other hand, we fixed a lot of things. So I'm quite happy about that. So if we look a little bit more in details at the SAT solver, like the way it represents the dependencies and the conflicts and so on is that it creates a set of Boolean expressions. So if we look at this first example here, we have a package foobar 1.0, which requires baz cooks in version 2.0 or greater. And so what this gets translated to is a set of expressions, which is that either the foobar package is not installed. So with the minus, it means that either this is not installed, or we need baz cooks 2.0 to be installed, or we need 2.0.1 installed or 2.1.0 installed. So that really just defines that this one is either not going to be there, or it needs its dependencies to be installed. Another example would be if you have a conflict. So same kind of relationship, but with a conflict, then you end up with 3 different rules here, which says that either foobar is missing or baz cooks is missing. in this version or that version or that version. So it's like a set of 3 rules there that say that foobar must be there. Well, must be either foobar is gone or bascooks is gone. So these are fairly simple rules, but then the main issue comes up with this one, where we say that when you require foobar into any version and you have 3 versions of foobar available, we have to create actually 3 conflict rules that exclude every time one version or the other from being installed together. So for every pair of versions, you end up with a conflict rule here, saying that either 1.0 is not installed, or 1.1 is not installed, or 1.0 is not, or and 1.2 is not, and so on. The purpose of this really is that we want to prevent installing 2 versions of the same package at the same time, because that's something we cannot do with PHP. Like, we just cannot have 2 classes of like 2 versions of the same class, for example, installed at the same time and load those 2 classes up. So we do have to enforce this. The problem is that with 3 rules, with 3 versions, as you see above, we get 3 rules, and that's fine. But this kind of grows like very, very quickly. And if you look at like 100 versions, you get 5,000 rules already. And then you go to like packages like Symfony, which have like all the Symfony components, for example, have around 500 versions at this point. That means that for every single Symfony component that you require, if the solver receives all its versions, which is not always the case, but still, like, just as a extreme example, that would create 125,000 rules just for one component. So if you load 50 components, you see the result is quickly like millions of rules. And this just really only gets worse as time goes and more versions are created. So in Composer 2, what do we have? Well, we have a single rule. No matter what, we just have one rule that contains a reference to each of the packages and says, look, I just want one of these to be installed, but not any combination. So this was kind of like a specialized tweak into the solver logic. And that really helps like tremendously for this problem. On the network side, we did a few things. So for the whole like metadata and package, like the zip archive downloads, we added a parallelized downloader using curl multi that will just like download stuff in parallel, which for the zip archive helps a little bit, but those are like fairly large sometimes, so that's not necessarily a huge win, but especially for the metadata where you might need to fetch like 100 packages or so on, as those are like small JSONs. This helps really a lot, especially with HTTP2 and like connection pooling and so on. Like you don't recreate new connections all the time. Like Composer 1 was just opening new SSL connections, and that's just super slow. So that fixed a lot of problems, and it just the fact that we also like did it internally allowed us to do it better than some plugins like Prestissimo or Symfony Flex. They were offering this functionality as well, but they were kind of working at a higher level, so they just couldn't do it for everything. So there we have like a more comprehensive solution, and pretty much everything is parallelized. Another aspect is that the protocol between packages.org and Composer was also improved quite a lot. And so that reduces the amount of data that's being shuffled around. The cacheability is also improved by the fact that we kind of split the dev releases, which kind of represent the branches from the rest, so that as long as you don't have like a new a new tagged release of a package, then the metadata you have on disk will be still like what you have in your cache will still be fresh. And then only when a new release actually is released will you get, will you have to download a new version of that file. So before you kind of got a new version of the file for every new commit in the repository, because that would update the dev version as well. Just a quick note here about curl. As I mentioned, we do use curl, so just make sure you have it installed. Like according to our stats, we see like really almost everyone has it. We see like 97% more or less of V2 users have curl running, so that's great. But if you don't, you will see really like much degraded performance. So make sure the curl extension is present. Another aspect that we parallelized was the extraction of the zip archives. So this only works on Linux OS X, and if you're on Windows, well, if you use Windows subsystem for Linux, this WSL, that means you're also running Linux. So in that case, it will work as well. I would highly recommend that. And then all that's needed is that you have the unzip CLI command installed, so that you can install fairly easily on Linux, at least with apt install unzip. And if that's available, we'll just like fork off the unzipping to new processes. So with all that done, we end up pretty much fixing like all of these points we highlighted initially. And we have really like massive speed improvements. So I did benchmark a few things and found like around 60% improvement, but this is really hard to put a number on, because it very much depends on what you're doing exactly, which dependencies you have, and so on. So it's kind of, you know, the exact number is fuzzy, but the bottom line is that we see, you know, 50 to 80% time reduction. And on the memory front as well, like maybe even more, like probably if you do the average there, it's about 80% of memory reduction. So that's really quite impressive, I think. And we might even see further improvements, at least on the memory front, in the next version. So I hope you all enjoy that. So I mentioned this reproducibility issue earlier, and I want to kind of highlight what we did there in terms of really splitting the Composer update and the Composer install process, which in Composer 1 were also kind of like a mishmash of commands, and this wasn't always clear what was going on. So in Composer 2, what happens is, like, if you run a Composer require or a Composer remove, for example, this will just modify your Composer JSON, and then internally it runs a Composer update. And then, so no matter what, when you run a Composer update, either just as a plain command or via these two, what happens is it reads the Composer JSON, it goes to packages.org or whatever repos you have configured, fetches package metadata, resolve the dependencies, and outputs a composer.log file. At that point, the update step is completed. We have a log file. That's really all we care about in the update step. Then comes the composer install command. And what that does is it only reads the composer.log file and then sees what packages need to be installed, fetches those from GitHub, and extracts these in the vendor directory. And so that's really all that install is doing. Now, if you already have stuff in the vendor directory, this might be doing like updates or like upgrades, downgrades of packages, removals of packages, and so on. But it is called install because it really just applies this log file into the vendor directory. Internally, though, when you run update, we also run an install afterwards, just for convenience, because mostly once you updated the log file, you want to install it, and so that just would be a pain if you had to do it yourself every time. But I think it's important to really see the distinction here. You will also see if you upgrade to V2 that the output is now split in two different sections. So in this example, if we see, okay, the vendor directory has this HTTP Foundation 518, because I tried to play around with upgrading it earlier. Then the composer log file, which I kind of reset from Git, still has 4416 into it. And then my composer JSON, I now change it to 50 star, which kind of, I realized, okay, 51 wasn't working, so I'm gonna try again with 50. Now, if I run an update with this state, what I get is, first of all, you see log file operations here. So that's really the update step that is showing me that it's upgrading from the log file 4416 to 5011, which is the latest state from the JSON file. So that's the upgrade here. And then internally it runs this install command, and the install command then looks at the vendor dir and says, okay, in the vendor dir there was a bunch of stuff here, like this is not needed anymore, these are newly needed, and HTTP Foundation was installed here in 518, so we're downgrading this to 5011, which is the version that is now in the log file. So I hope this makes it clear. Now you have really two sections: things that happen to your log file, and then things which are happening to your vendor directory. So a few new features I want to highlight, like kind of smaller things we didn't mention in the release announcement, so you may have missed them. One new flag we added was is -- ignore platform rec without the S. So previously you had this option here with the S, which let you like ignore all the platform requirements. So that means all the PHP requirements and the PHP version, PHP extension requirements would all get ignored. And if you wanted to test, let's say on PHP 8 and something didn't allow you to do that, you could use that to kind of override it and say, hey, look, I don't care. I'll try my luck and just do it. However, it just didn't warn you anymore about PHP extensions, which were missing if you did that. So now you have a more like fine-grained approach there, where you can specify the exact package you want to ignore. As a side note to that, just a recommendation: when you're like before deploying or like as part of your build script, it might be a good idea to run the check platform recs command, which will actually check that the platform requirements from all your packages are fulfilled by the current PHP version that you're running on production or on the build machine and so on. So that just might be like a good safety check. Another feature is partial updates with like a temporary constraint. So if we're looking at something like this, where in the composer JSON you require any version 4 or 5, and then in the log file you have like 4416. But then if you run composer updates with Symfony HTTP Foundation, you would get bumped to like 5.2 point something at this point. And that might be just too much, and you want to try with 5.0. So you can run a composer update again with the package you want to update, and then this colon here, 50, and like kind of any constraint here will just override the constraint temporarily in the JSON file, run the update, and then just like it won't actually change your JSON file on disk. So it just does this in memory. If you want to just try to quickly downgrade something or play around, this can be useful. Sorry. Another big change actually is that repositories are now canonical. What this means is that the first repository in which a package name is found will win, and then it will stop looking. So if you have multiple composer repositories listed, before it was so that it would just look through all of them and find all the packages, and then in some cases you had some really nasty effects with that, in that it could like kind of not install the thing you expected just because a newer version was available in another repository, for example. So we changed that now and made this canonical by default. If you want to change that, you can set this flag canonical false on the repository definition, or you can also specify like exactly some packages you want from a given repository, or exclude some packages you don't want from a repository, and so on. So this kind of lets you pick the packages you want. So how do you upgrade to Composer 2? The best case scenario is you just run composer self-update --2. Then you can try composer update or composer installed, and everything just works, and it's just gonna work faster and so on. So that's just, if that's your experience, that's amazing. You can then move on and be happy. However, you might run into issues. The main reason for issues really is plugins, because like all plugins are forced to require a Composer plugin API, which changed now to version 2. So that means that all plugins do not run on Composer 2. They have to be updated. Some of them have been already updated like months ago, so you might have already versions which are compatible. But if that's not the case and you cannot update the plugin to a version that supports Composer 2, you should reach out to the plugin author, or maybe just remove the plugin if you don't need it anymore. You kind of have to look on a case-by-case basis there. But I think at this point, most of the popular plugins are compatible. If you're using Symfony, Flex has been really compatible for a long time now, so that shouldn't be an issue. One package that is fairly likely to cause you problems is ocramius package versions. The reason there is that if like the only version that supports Composer 2 also requires PHP 7.4. So if you're not yet on PHP 7.4 and you're using like Doctrine, for example, which itself requires this package version package, you'll probably get stuck there with some errors. And so what we did there was we forked the package, and you can just require this fork, which is called composer/package versions deprecated. Just requiring this will fulfill the requirements for things depending on the original package. And this works on PHP 7.0 and above, so this should get everything working really. However, if you depend on this package yourself, then I would highly recommend, like, and you're upgrading to Composer 2, then I would just say like drop it and use the native utilities we added for this, which kind of replace what the package was, like the plugin was doing before. So I think that's a better option, to just use the native stuff. And like long term, this should be what people aim for. If you experience auto-loading issues, like we added these warnings in Composer 1 probably 1 or 2 years ago, I don't remember. I know some people have been ignoring them religiously. So now it means that the warnings will actually apply, and these files will not be auto-loadable anymore. I think in most cases I've looked at, these were like small misconfigurations of test files and stuff like that, where there actually wouldn't be any impact on the application, but usually it's fixable by just like fixing your autoload config to split the test like the test autoloading from the regular autoloading and so on. So how far along are we with the adoption? Just a quick note here. So as of a few days ago, we had about 34% of installs running with V2 and 22% of updates. So I think that's pretty good. It did ramp up like pretty quickly initially, and now it's kind of slowly going up. So I'm hoping we can speed that up a little bit. Current release is 208 already, so we did fix like really most issues at this point. Like I think like this week there were no new issue reported, for example. So it's really like we're down to really super weird edge cases at this point. So the odds that you're experiencing an issue that is not plugin related are very, very low, I would say. So don't fear the upgrade. Just give it a shot. So again, Composer self-update --2, you'll get a new version. And in the worst case, like if things go bad, the log file, you should have it committed, so you can always just git check out Composer log, and then go back to V1 using Composer self-update --1. So there's really hardly any risk involved here in trying it out. If you need more convincing, you can read these various tweets of happy people that are like trying it and being blown away by how fast and everything it is. So hopefully that convinces you if I didn't. As a side note, we saw like already just from those 20-some% of updates that are done on V2, we already saw like a massive reduction in bandwidth that we're using on the packages.org side. So that's a nice side effect for us, is that we really see the protocol improvements paying off there. So due to that, we also really want to push everyone to upgrade, because that would like simplify our infrastructure and also allow us to like drop the entire Composer 1 metadata stuff, which is kind of a pain to maintain at this point. So if you want to help us help you, let's say, just upgrade. And then just a quick word about like the roadmap going forward. We plan to require like PHP 7.1 in Composer 2.2. And that's something I didn't mention yet, but Composer 2.0 still supports PHP 5.3. PHP 5.3 is really old at this point. And it's quite a pain to maintain this. But we did want everyone to be able to upgrade, so we went like kind of the extra mile there in terms of compatibility, just to make sure that we didn't leave anyone stuck on Composer 1 just because of the PHP version. That said, I don't want to do this forever, so as of 2.0, we will drop the old versions and kind of be able to clean up a little bit. And to kind of support this, 2.1 will be sort of like an LTS release where we will still have the PHP 5.3 support, and we'll do bug fixes, like as let's say critical fixes and security fixes, just to make sure that people have still a version they can turn to in the future. But if you want the latest, like nicer features after that, then you'll have to update to 7.1. And then comes the big question of when we will disable Composer 1 support on packages.org. And I really can't say, like, I think it highly depends on usage. Like, as long as we see right now, almost 80% of users are still on V1, like there's no chance we can disable this. So it really depends on users to actually move towards V2. So please help with that again. Finally, just some resources. Mostly it's all accessible via this link here. So if you go to getcomposer.org/2, you'll get to the release announcement, which has links to the rest. So you can access that easily.